Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we've got an in-person interview. I'm here with Dr. Brian Cutter of Notre Dame, works on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, all sorts of really cool topics. And I think today we're going to be talking about your favorite arguments for God's existence, or maybe the best arguments for God's existence in your view. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so what in your view are the best, or maybe your favorite arguments for God's existence?
Good. Yeah. So the arguments I tend to find most compelling are kind of abductive arguments for the existence of God. I'm not too moved by traditional ontological arguments or standard cosmological arguments. The considerations that move me most are kind of the sense that there are a range of striking features of our universe that, at least taken collectively, seem to be naturally explained by the hypothesis of theism, and which are kind of otherwise very puzzling, at least taken collectively, on alternatives like naturalism. So the fact that our universe is a law-governed place, exhibits lawful regularities, that those laws are relatively simple, but not so simple as to preclude anything interesting from happening, that they're elegant, beautiful, mathematically intelligible. The laws of nature allow for consciousness, which is arguably the precondition for anything of value existing at all in the universe, or at least certain forms of value existing in the universe. That's a striking fact. The fact that the laws kind of pair consciousness with physical states in striking, fortunate, harmonious ways. The fact that the laws are fine-tuned for life. The fact that there's moral knowledge and capacity for other kinds of intuitive, abstract knowledge that is otherwise hard to explain on naturalistic views. So kind of a range of kind of broad, striking features of our universe that are kind of much more to be expected given theism than our naturalism, it seems to me. And so kind of collectively, like those sorts of considerations are what move me most towards theism.
Okay, so we've got like a broadly abductive approach, or maybe is this sort of theory comparison? Are you thinking maybe in Bayesian terms? And what's the best sort of way to formulate it in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of inclined to rest on Bayesian formulations for like the official versions of these arguments. So yeah, I mean, I think the best way to run these arguments, if we're going to be careful, is to think in Bayesian terms first about like, what are reasonable priors, and those are going to be based on simplicity considerations. And then I think, step one will be you can make a reasonable case that theism is looking not too bad on the priors. It has certain theoretical virtues of simplicity and non-arbitrariness and so forth that make it kind of in the running as far as the priors go. And then we've got a range of striking facts that are collectively, much more likely, it seems to me, on theism than other rivals, naturalism. Maybe they're just as likely on certain kind of quasi-theistic or theist-adjacent views, like views where there is a designer, but the designer is imperfect, or maybe certain axiarchic views. But yeah, there, I think we'd kind of independently have arguments that like theism is to be preferred either on the basis of the priors or on the basis of kind of, well, yeah. So mainly, I think the considerations at that point would be like theism looks better on the priors than some of these rival hypotheses.
Awesome. So how about we go through some of these striking facts? So you mentioned a number of them. I think you mentioned like the laws, the structure of the laws. You mentioned, I think, psychophysical harmony, maybe the fact that the laws apply to the physical universe in such a way as to evolve the universe forward in interesting ways. Yeah. You mentioned moral knowledge and various other sorts of things. So how about let's just take some of these striking facts one by one and go through them and just talk about them. So I'll let you pick. Where do you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, most of my work is in philosophy of mind. I work on like metaphysics of consciousness. So maybe let's start with consciousness-related facts. So here I mentioned two things. One is the fact that consciousness exists at all. And kind of in the background here is, I think there are good arguments from Chalmers and others that consciousness is an irreducible feature of reality. I think it's also plausible that consciousness is the basis of all or many forms of value. So, here's a fact about the universe. Like, one of the basic features of our universe is consciousness. It didn't obviously have to be that way. Given naturalism, there's no special reason to expect that consciousness would be included among the basic aspects or features of the universe. Given theism, that's not surprising at all. I mean, especially given consciousness's role in grounding many or all forms of value. You'd expect a being who's perfectly good and would act for the sake of realizing value, would act for the sake of the good. You'd expect such a being to create a world with consciousness, whereas that's comparatively surprising on naturals. So that's just like the bare existence of consciousness, or if you want to think in terms of the laws, that there are laws of nature that specifically make provision for consciousness. That, I think, is a striking fact about our universe, the kind of nomological structure of our universe, that's much less surprising on theism than it is on naturalism. One thing kind of going further in this vein that I've written about with Dustin Crummett is this argument from psychophysical harmony. So this refers to the fact not just that there is consciousness, but that the laws of nature link consciousness to physical states and to other conscious states in such a way, in a kind of suspiciously fortunate or seemingly lucky way. So there's lots of examples of this, but maybe the clearest cases have to do with hedonic experience like pleasure and pain. So we've got laws of nature that map certain states of our brain onto experiences of pain. Those very same brain states tend to dispose us towards avoidance behavior. Now, intuitively, pain is essentially bad. It essentially gives us reason to avoid it and eliminate it when we have it. And the laws of nature map physical states onto pain in such a way that, when we have pain, we also engage in the very sorts of behaviors that pain justifies or rationalizes. So the psychophysical laws, the laws of nature linking physical states to states of consciousness, are sort of harmonize the descriptive role of pain, the sorts of behaviors it tends to go with, and the normative role of pain, the sorts of behaviors that it gives us reason to perform. And there are a number of other examples like that so this is a striking feature of the laws of nature. The psychophysical laws link states of consciousness with physical states of matter in harmonious ways, ways that kind of achieve harmony between the descriptive and normative roles of our conscious experiences. It didn't obviously have to be this way. It seems like most conceivable ways of mapping physical states onto experiences would have been disharmonious. So an extreme case would be you take the actual physical basis of pain and you map it onto pleasure, and then you invert that. You take the actual physical basis of pleasure, you map it onto pain. So this would be a kind of hedonically inverted world. This would be a horrible situation. We'd be systematically pursuing experiences that we have reason to avoid. We'd be systematically avoiding experiences we have reason to pursue. Our behavior and functioning would be radically in disharmony with the reasons or normative roles of our experience. Less extreme scenario would just be where the psychophysical laws map the actual physical basis of pain or pleasure onto some evaluatively neutral sensation. That would be a lesser form of disharmony, where we're systematically pursuing and avoiding experiences that we have no reason to pursue or avoid. So you might think, this is a striking fact. The laws of nature kind of map physical states onto phenomenal states in these harmonious ways. It's especially striking when you consider that most of the most simple psychophysical mappings also seem to have this disharmony property. So it seems like, a range of very simple mappings, like maybe a mapping that maps every physical state onto the same neutral gray sensation, or a mapping that maps things onto experiences on the gray scale in proportion to their mass. There's lots of very simple psychophysical mappings that wouldn't have achieved psychophysical harmony. So it seems like intuitively most mappings, including the simplest, wouldn't have been psychophysically harmonious. So the fact that our psychophysical laws are harmonious seems like something that's very surprising on naturalism, comparatively unsurprising on theism. So Dustin and I think that this is powerful evidence for theism.
Awesome. So I think we're going to try to camp out on maybe two arguments for the video, and one will be psychophysical harmony, and I'm thinking the other one will be another kind of harmony argument, nomological harmony. Both of these are based on really recent work that Brian Cutter has done with Dustin Crummett on the psychophysical harmony argument, and a number of other people have published on psychophysical luck or psychophysical harmony, including Chalmers and Adam Powitz and others. And then with the nomological harmony, I think you did that with Brad Sad. Is that
Brad Thought? Yeah.
Good thought. Okay, awesome. I'm not good at pronunciation, as you guys
I'm
can
pretty
see.
sure that's how to pronounce
Okay, well,
I've never asked this.
A check.
Maybe I should mod.
Okay, so let's camp out a little bit on the psychophysical harmony. Now, the first thing that comes to people's mind almost immediately when they hear this argument is, have you not heard of the theory of evolution? But surely, like, clearly, when we experience tissue damage, it's clear that we would feel pain, and it's pain would cause us to avoid the sort of tissue damage that's caused by whatever noxious stimulus caused that. And the organisms which experience pleasure in response to that sort of noxious stimuli, they systematically pursue that sort of those sorts of states, and they would be selected against because of that, because they're pursuing tissue damage and all those sorts of things. So if we just have a straightforward evolutionary explanation, what's so bad about that?
Yeah, good. So this explanation, it doesn't explain psychophysical harmony. It doesn't explain why pain is associated with avoidance behavior. It presupposes psychophysical harmony. So it presupposes that pain is going to be associated with avoidance behavior. So given that pain has this like nomically robust association with avoidance behavior, you can see why evolution would want to give us pain, or would select for creatures that have pain in response to bodily damage, because that's going to lead to the avoidance behavior. But wouldn't want to have us experience pain in response to like eating nutritious berries, because the creatures that exhibit avoidance behavior in response to nutritious berries are not going to survive very long. They're not going to pass on their genes. So that explanation for why we tend to experience pain in response to potentially harmful maladaptive stimuli, it looks like it presupposes psychophysical harmony. It doesn't explain it. I think it's fine to presuppose this general fact about how pain is associated with avoidance behavior in explaining why we tend to feel pain in response to bodily damage. That's a perfectly good explanation, but it's not an explanation of psychophysical harmony. It's an explanation for why we tend to feel pain in response to bodily damage, not why we tend to exhibit avoidance behavior in response to pain.
Right. Well, I guess one way, so I fully agree with that, of course. And one way that I like to think about this is, suppose that the psychophysical mappings had been different. Suppose that pleasure had been mapped on to the various brain states that cause avoidance behavior instead of pursuance behavior. And suppose that, the experience of pleasure also was, did I say pain originally? I meant pleasure. Whatever. Suppose that pleasure is associated with the various brain states that cause avoidance behavior. Suppose also that pleasure is in fact associated with the bodily states, which are typically, tissue damage, other noxious stimuli cause that. Suppose that was the psychophysical map. Well, then evolution actually would have selected the organisms which feel pleasure in response to the tissue damage and whatnot, because that's what's actually associated with avoidance behavior. So these organisms are going to be systematically avoiding what causes tissue damage and noxious stimuli and other sorts of things. So given that, it just seems like evolution really isn't explaining psychophysical harmony. It comes early in the explanatory chain, as it were. Okay, so evolution, that doesn't seem to be a good response. What about normative error theory? So you're seeming to rely on these various claims about what's valuable. Things like we got normative properties of mental states like pain. Pain seems bad. Mm-hmm. It seems to rationalize or render rationally appropriate certain responses to it.
Yeah.
So what if we just say, no, there are no truths about what's good, bad, what's rationally appropriate in light of pain? No, that's all hogwash.
Yeah, good. So I think one thing to say here is if this is the best way out for the naturalists, if this is the best way to avoid the argument from psychophysical harmony to theism, it's an extremely costly response, because I think normative error theory is just extremely implausible. The idea that some things like excruciating pain are bad, or that some actions are wrong, or that other normative truths hold, seem to me to be among the most solid, intuitively plausible starting points in all of philosophy. I mean, we need to start somewhere. I think it's good philosophical methodology to start with the claims that seem most blindingly obvious theoretically, and claims like, excruciating pain is bad, torturing children for fun is wrong. These kind of
and it's good to avoid that sort of excruciating states.
I mean, these seem to be among the most solid starting points that we could have in starting to develop philosophical theory. So I think that's just a hugely costly response. The second point is it's not going to avoid all kinds of psychophysical harmony. So it'll avoid the example involving pleasure and pain that I mentioned. But there's another class of examples of psychophysical harmony that Dustin and I talk about in the paper, which we call semantic harmony. So this is that the fact that experiences and physical states are linked to one another in kind of semantically appropriate ways, or ways that make our judgments and reports about consciousness come out true. So simple case of this is, I have an experience of like a yellow square next to a green circle, and I report I'm having an experience of a yellow square next to a green circle. Now, suppose for simplicity that some kind of like epiphenomenalist theory is right. So causal closure of the physical is true. The complete causal explanation of that utterance is just physical processes in my brain. Well, then it looks kind of lucky that the psychophysical laws mapped my brain state onto experiences in such a way as to make my verbal reports about consciousness come out true. There's lots of possible psychophysical mappings where that wouldn't have been the case. So it could have been that the psychophysical laws map each brain state onto a different TV static-like experience with maybe patterns of static that are kind of like isomorphic to the like microscopic chaotic structure of particles in my brain. Well, then I wouldn't have experiences of like smooth yellow circle next to a smooth like red square or whatever. So any reports I make to that effect would come out false. Other examples that are closer to what David Chalmers calls the meta problem of consciousness are reports kind of about the metaphysical status or the apparent metaphysical status of consciousness. So we report things like consciousness seems to be non-physical. Consciousness is irreducible to physical processing in the brain. There's an ontological gap between physics and consciousness. Once you explain the functioning, you don't thereby explain the experience. Assume for now, and at this stage of the argument, that those are true metaphysical claims about consciousness. Then it just looks wildly lucky that the psychophysical laws would have mapped like my current. So I have a brain state. That brain state disposes me to say things like, I'm in a non-physical state of consciousness, something over and above the physical. And lo and behold, the psychophysical laws map that state onto a non-physical state of consciousness that's irreducible to the physical, the very kind of state that would make that report true, even though that state is not playing any causal role in generating that report. That just looks wildly. So, that kind of harmony doesn't presuppose that there are any normative facts about what's good, what's bad, what we have reason to pursue. It just presupposes that there are like semantic facts, that reports can be true or false. And so I think that just sidesteps the normative error theory problem.
Okay. So we're going to move on to other objections. Cool. One that literally just came to mind that I've never thought of in the past, I can't believe I've never thought of this. And it's very risky bringing this up because this is totally raw philosophizing. You guys are getting live thinking. Okay, this is a very raw thought. But
all right.
These explanatory gap arguments, knowledge arguments for dualism.
Yeah.
What David Builes points out in one of his recent papers in Philosophy Compass on first-person realism, it's called 8 Arguments for First-Person Realism, is that a lot of these arguments can be given, a lot of parallel arguments can be given for the view that there are like these fundamental facts about who I am, me specifically. Like there are these special facts about me.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, because you can give me a full description of the third-person fact, and it seems like I can't derive any first-person facts. Well, which one am I? You can describe third personally what the world is like, but there's this further question: who am I? So there's this explanatory gap. There seems to be an epistemic gap, as I was just mentioning. Seems conceivable that I be this third-person description, that I be that third-person description.
Yep.
So there also seems to be some sort of conceivability gap. So if we're motivated to dualism for these sorts of considerations, maybe we're also motivated to first-person realism by these same considerations. Yeah. But then that brings up this question: is there a kind of first-person harmony where who I am strikingly so we got this third-person fact, and I know that I have these various interests. Mm-hmm. And third-personally, we can describe the third-person realm in such a way that there's one being which always seems to act in ways that fulfill what I know from my first-person perspective are my interests. Mm-hmm. And so, but there's this striking correlation, and I find out, lo and behold, I am that third person. I am that person, right? So there's this striking harmony, and should we posit a God to explain it? But what I'm trying to do is maybe this is a reductio. If we go along with the psychophysical harmony argument, we should also go along with this first-person harmony argument. But it seems very implausible that like we could reflect on this first-person harmony and get to like a theistic conclusion. Because I could have found myself with all these desires that I have, maybe we think, in some other kind of third-person profile that doesn't pursue the desires and like systematically frustrates them.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a version of psychophysical harmony. I don't know, but that's a really raw thought that just immediately came to mind.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So these arguments for first-person realism are, I'd want to say, extremely interesting, and there are very notable parallels with standard arguments for dualism. I guess where I would want to get off the boat in this line of argument is in the first stage where we argue for first-person realism. That I think we should not accept first-person realism.
I agree.
Well, I think it's just kind of crazy on its face that there's something metaphysically special about me over and against other people. In the same way that according to presentists, there's something metaphysically privileged about the present over and against other times, or according to non-modal realists, that there's something metaphysically privileged about the actual world over and against other possible worlds. So I think that view seems kind of crazy on its face in a way that I don't think dualism is crazy on its face. So that should motivate some search for like where those arguments go wrong and possible disanalogies between the standard epistemic gap arguments for dualism and the parallel arguments for first-person realism. I guess what I would say there is it's not too hard to find a disanalogy where, the epistemic gap arguments for dualism take the conceivability argument. We're going to have some conceivability to possibility linking principle. The crudest, most simplistic, most naive version is just if it's conceivable, then it's possible. But for tons of reasons that are very familiar, that's not going to work for kind of Kripkean cases of a posteriori necessity. So we're going to want a more circumscribed principle. A typical way of restricting the principle is to say, well, if something is conceivable and it contains no twin earthable terms or something like this, or only super rigid terms or something along these lines, then you can infer possibility. But if that's your operative conceivability possibility linking principle, then I think the arguments for first-person realism aren't going to go through because they're going to use this indexical I, which is paradigmatically twin earthable.
Right. Yes,
so
exactly.
it's not going to satisfy the restriction.
Okay, interesting. So then maybe you would want to run, so, the psychophysical harmony argument crucially just relies on the conceivability of different psychophysical pairings, right? So would you want to modify the psychophysical harmony argument in such a way that it specifically relies on conceivability where you don't have twin earthable expressions?
Oh.
Because I'm just thinking, again, in order to run my kind of parody argument, what I'm trying to do is say we can have a parody argument for theism, which seems kind of crazy.
I see.
Because these various alternative situations where I am not the third personally described being which systematically pursues my interests and whatnot, that seems conceivable, at least in some sense. And so then we have this question, well, why am I in fact? What explains this striking fact that I am in fact the third person profile which systematically pursues my interest? And so long as even it's conceivable that that's not the case, I think that's all we need to be able to run this sort of parody argument. So, but my point is just that maybe you will just want to restrict the kind of conceivability at play in the psychophysical harmony argument. I'll let you finish on this because we need to go on to other objections. So I'll just pass the baton over to you and you can just close off with that one.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I would need to think more about how I'd want to respond to this. I'm not seeing immediately that it is going to be conceivable that I would have different interests from what so it's conceivable that I could have occupied a different point of view.
Yeah.
But conditional on me occupying a different point of view, I would have different interests or the interests associated with that point of view. So I think it ends up, it's not going to be epistemically lucky that I have the interest associated with whatever point of view I occupy. But
this is something that immediately came to my mind. I want to, that's what we're here for. We're here to test these sorts of ideas. I don't just want this to be this rote interview where you just like read off the script of everything you've been through. I want to pose
these fresh.
this is like, these are fresh things. And this is what philosophy is. We test out these thoughts that we haven't really thought of in the past, and we're just doing that live. So that's what I want to kind of demonstrate for the audience. So who knows, maybe that was just a totally confused objection. That's fine. And we learn. So we continue and we go on. Okay. Contingent normative roles response.
Yeah.
That's one that you consider in the paper. Maybe you could just explain what that is and then how you guys respond to it.
Yeah, good. So the basic thought here is, well, suppose that the badness of pain is contingent on the attitude we take towards it. So pain kind of intrinsically, according to this view, there's nothing bad about pain considered in and of itself. It's the fact that we tend to dislike it that makes it bad. So if pain had, if the psychophysical laws had linked, let's say, given us a different sensation in this physical circumstances where we actually feel pain, then we would have disliked that sensation, and that would have been bad. And so, whatever sensation kind of plays the pain role is going to be bad. And therefore, it's no surprise that there's this harmonious correspondence between the state that's bad and the one that we tend to avoid is the basic thought. So, what do we say in response to this? The basic move is, okay, let's distinguish two versions of this attitudinal view of what makes pain bad or what makes pain unpleasant. So one view is that what makes pain bad is the fact that we like it. It is the fact that we dislike it, where that state of dislike is itself a phenomenal state. So I think Guy Kahane calls this the felt dislike view. Another view is that our disliking it is kind of functionally reducible. For us to dislike it in the relevant sense is just for us to be disposed to behave in ways that tend to eliminate it and so forth. So our view is that the first of these views is somewhat plausible, but doesn't solve the problem. And the second is not plausible, even though it would solve the problem if it were true. So why does the first one, with the felt dislike view, not solve the problem? Now we think that just kind of moves the bump in the rug. So the puzzle now is, now we've got this state, felt dislike, that confers badness on whatever sensation it's directed towards. So now the puzzle is, why is this phenomenal state, the badness conferring state, linked to physical behavior in harmonious ways?
Yeah, when conceivably it could have failed to be like that.
Yeah, we could have had the felt dislike attitude towards the sensations that we then go on to behaviorally promote and so on. So that would have been disharmonious. Okay, so that just moves the bump in the rug from why is the intrinsically bad experience linked to behavior in harmonious ways to why is the badness conferring phenomenal state linked to behavior in harmonious ways. The other view, where we kind of take a more reductive functionalist view of dislike, where like to dislike something is to just be kind of strongly disposed to behave in ways that tend towards its elimination and reduction. That would solve the problem, but I think it's just independently implausible, because we think like whether you're having an experience that's intrinsically bad or that you have reason to avoid doesn't depend at all on its functional role vis-a-vis physical behavior. One reason to think this is to imagine you're in a Cartesian skeptical scenario where you have no physical body, there's no physical world at all, and so none of your sensations or experiences have any tendency at all to produce avoidance behavior in the sense of physical behavior that tends towards its elimination. It's still nonetheless obviously true that when you're in excruciating pain, like you're in a state that's bad.
Yeah, suppose that the evil demon is like just instilling excruciating pain constantly into this Cartesian ego or this Cartesian soul. That seems to be bad.
Yeah. And the badness of this does not depend on whether you actually have a body. The kind of functional role of that state vis-a-vis anything bodily is completely irrelevant to the normative status of that state. I mean, one way to think about this is just from the perspective of first personal Cartesian doubt. You're having this excruciating pain, and then your philosophy professor walks you through the first couple meditations and asks you, oh, can you be sure that there's really a physical world? You might think like, look, maybe I'm being fooled by the demon. Maybe there's not really a physical world. But even if that's right, it's clear that like my experience is bad. The badness of my experience just does not depend on its relations to anything physical or anything outside the phenomenal domain at all.
Right. Okay. Next objection is a priori physicalism. So your argument here relies on, hey, it's at least conceivable that there are these alternate psychophysical mappings, these different pairings between mental states and physical states. It's at least conceivable that we have this kind of inversion, the hedonic inversion. It's conceivable that things had gone differently. But I guess a priori physicalists push back on that. They say, no, there's actually an a priori knowable connection between physical states, like brain states, say, C fiber firing, and the mental states that they're correlated with, such as pain. There are different versions of a priori physicalism, of course. I mean, depending on how you cash them out, maybe eliminative materialism could count as one of these, maybe kind of illusionism could count as this sort of thing. So, and there are very serious, intellectually robust defenses of these sorts of views. So what do you think about pushing back to this argument by adopting, or at least saying that a priori physicalism is at least reasonably plausible? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I do want to concede that given type A or a priori physicalism, the problem is pretty much dissolved. I mean, so one straightforward version of a priori physicalism would be the analytic functionalism of David Armstrong and David Lewis, where the thought is like the concept of pain is just the concept of the state that plays such and such causal role is typically caused by bodily damage, typically causes avoidance behavior, and so forth. It's going to be more complicated than that, but something along those lines. So if the concept of pain is just the concept of the state that, among other things, leads to avoidance behavior, then it's just no mystery at all as to why it is that when we have pain, we tend to engage in avoidance behavior. In fact, we should expect that to be epistemically certain conditional on naturalism. And so the argument fails if that kind of a priori physicalism is true. The main thing we have to say here is we just think that there are like very powerful reasons to reject a priori physicalism. We don't really have anything original to say here, but the kind of standard worries are like, well, it predicts falsely that zombies are inconceivable. It predicts falsely that Mary doesn't learn anything new when she goes out of her room and experiences red for the first time. It predicts falsely that inverted spectrum scenarios are inconceivable. Most versions predict, again, falsely that like ghosts are inconceivable, where these would be like disembodied, maybe like Cartesian minds with experiences just like yours. Like if you think the concept of having such and such experience is a functional concept involving causal relations to like physical stimuli and outward physical behavior, then it looks like it's as a conceptual truth. You couldn't have experiences just like yours without having a body. But that looks false. That is conceptually possible, as evidenced by the fact that like we can't conclusively rule out Cartesian skeptical scenarios a priori. So concede the point that type A physicalism would undermine the argument, but we just think that's not really a view in the running for us.
Yeah. So I do have some like higher order uncertainty about this because they're really intelligent people who do topic, but like, it just seems so clear to me that if you give a complete physical description of a neuron or a nervous system or the brain, like you're just going to be talking about ions flowing across certain channels and synapses and acetylcholine and all this sort of stuff. None of that information, it just seems categorically, none of that information is such that when you inspect it, you'd be able to just derive from the armchair that there even is consciousness associated with it, but also that it would be pain specifically as opposed to pleasure or like static sensations or like tepid bathwater, as Dustin Crummett says. It's just not the sort of properties that neuroscientists deal in. Like neuroscientists are studying the physical properties that we're going to be talking about charge and momentum and mass and the hertz at which neurons fire. And that alone, that information alone, you're not going to be able to logically derive from that information, purely physical information, the mental states. I mean, that just seems really, really plausible to me.
Yeah, that seems solid. And I think it's solid even without knowing lots and lots of the details of all the physical things going on in your brain. I think it's just kind of intuitively a priori clear that that's the wrong kind of information from which you could a priori deduce that you're having an experience of red or that you're having a feeling of pain. I mean, an analogy I like is, the epistemic gap between purely geometric descriptions of something and whether it's bright pinks. Like, even though I don't know the fine-grained microgeometry of this surface, it's just completely obvious that no amount of purely geometric information about the spatial distances of different parts and the shapes of the fine particles and so on, that's just not the right kind of information that could allow you to a priori deduce that it's bright pink. And in a similar way, the gap between purely physical information and phenomenal truths, just like seeing that's not information of the right kind.
Right. And it's notable that merely conceding this kind of a priori gap does not by itself implicate us in some kind of spooky dualism, as it were. Like, you can be a respectable physicalist and say, well, of course you can logically derive that, but things, A can be identical with B, even if we can't logically derive that B is identical with A, from the armchair without having to go out and actually investigate things. So, I just want to note that for the audience that, the argument isn't committed to that sort of thing. Okay, maybe 2 or 3 more objections to the psychophysical harmony argument. We'll be brief with those. And then I'll just briefly let you explain what the problem of nomological harmony is and what the argument is. Okay, so I guess maybe this isn't so much an objection to the psychophysical harmony argument as just saying, hey, if we go along with it, and problems for theism get worse. Okay. So we might think that the problem of evil gets considerably worse because it seems like the psychophysical laws could have been fine-tuned in a much better way to get rid of lots of suffering without losing comparable good or preventing worse, equally bad or worse evils. So we might think, I know you gave a talk about this today, right? But we might think throughout the evolutionary process, it seems like God could have designed the psychophysical laws in such a way that when non-human animals are facing certain death, when they're burning in a forest fire, the psychophysical laws kick in, they're sensitive to that sort of information. God's their designer, you can make them arbitrarily complex. The psychophysical laws kick in and make it so that the organism either becomes zombie there without phenomenal consciousness, or it just experiences bliss, or just experiences some kind of neutral state when it's facing certain death. So in this case, it seems like that does away with quintillions upon quintillions of, maybe that's an exaggeration, but billions on billions upon animals for hundreds of millions of years experiencing excruciating suffering. Likewise, we might think, it seems like my default state, at least, is just my default mental state is a kind of neutral. It doesn't seem like axiologically good or bad per se. It's just a kind of neutral. Just when I'm sitting there staring at a wall or something. Yeah. It's not really positive or something like that. And it seems like God could have made the world so much better just by having the default state, just a slight kind of pleasure or something like that. Or just for all conscious creatures of all time, think about how much time that would be, and aggregating that well-being increase would just be monstrous. It'd make the world so much better. It doesn't seem to come, especially if it doesn't affect any physical fat. So it's not as though this brings about less virtue. It's not as though it brings about, so we might think that this brings about whole swaths of gratuitous evil or something like that into the picture, and it may make the problem of evil considerably worse than the theist. That's what one might think.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so you're certainly pointing to potentially troubling facts for theism. I wonder whether or how much they arise out of psychophysical harmony, or whether they're just kind of merely considerations in the vicinity of, once you start to think about that God has control over the psychophysical laws, you can ask, why didn't he make these tweaks that would have seemed better? And so even if God doesn't have control over the psychophysical laws, versions of these problems arise. Maybe he couldn't make it so that the fawn doesn't die an agonizing death in the fire by miraculously suspending the psychophysical laws, but still letting the body of the fawn burn. But there were plenty of other ways for God to prevent the fawn from dying in the fire, just by snatching them away or mercy killing or whatever. And so I don't know if either psychophysical harmony or just like a sensitivity to the fact that there's some contingency in the psychophysical laws does anything to make the problem of evil worse, though maybe it focuses the attention on certain aspects that were already there.
So what I was thinking was, a lot of people might think like, well, if you tinker with the psychophysical laws in that sort of way, it would have to have some kind of physical effect down the line, and maybe, certain greater goods wouldn't be produced as a result of it. But like, if you go along with the psychophysical harmony argument, it seems like, no, actually, we can totally well conceive that the physical facts, so the physical distribution of qualities in the world is exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's just we're solely tweaking the mental states without any sort of difference to what goods accrue down the line.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then the other thing was, those sorts of maneuvers, people have rejected that. Well, that would make the world irregular. That would have all these other sorts of things. But like God tweaking the psychophysical laws from the outset, I'm not saying he's like suspending the psychophysical laws. He just designs them better, like so that they're sensitive to like what state the organism's in. They're sensitive to facts about like whether or not the organism is in impending doom or something like that. So that wouldn't seem to involve any irregularity. So you get around that, and you can preserve physical.
I see. So I guess I'm not sure it would introduce irregularity. So, I mean, one way to think about irregularity is, well, you have irregularity when there are lots of isolated violations of the laws. But another way of thinking about it, which might actually come to the same thing on maybe human ways of thinking about laws, is just that there aren't simple patterns that are kind of universally instantiated across. So like, but arguably, if God makes the laws such that they kind of bend in very specific circumstances, so the laws have all these like caveats built in. So instead of temporarily suspending the laws and doing a miracle here, he just kind of builds very specific contingencies into the laws such that everything is in accordance with the laws. Arguably, that introduces the same degree of irregularity. It just kind of puts the messiness in the laws rather than in the occasions of suspending the laws. I mean, whether there's a difference there, it still might be like a defect of a broadly similar kind. So I think there's at least room to run anti-regularity or regularity kind of theodicies there. Also, one reason why people like Van Inwagen say that regularity is a defect is that it's highly deceptive. And I think it would be equally deceptive whether there are temporary suspensions of laws of nature versus these like gerrymandered laws of nature. Like given our natural cognitive capacities to kind of extrapolate in natural ways from the observed regularities, we would be just as deceived whether there's exceptions to the laws or gerrymandered laws themselves.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking is like, what's so bad about being deceived about this one kind of small fact about animal experience?
But I take
compared to like the suffering that you're prevented.
Okay, but I take it that's an objection to regularity style theodicies in general, which I'm sympathetic to. Like, okay, regularity seems to be this aesthetic good. Can we really weigh that on the same scale?
Right.
Like all this horrific suffering. But I do think, maybe some of the other theodicies wouldn't work so well if God was kind of carving out these exceptions or temporarily suspending the psychophysical laws. So if we think of kind of Swinburne style theodicies about the value of actually making a difference as to whether good or bad things happen, or actually or the value of like animals showing resilience in the face of pain, this is something that kind of you can't do. You can't make a difference to whether or not an animal suffers if God has a standing policy of preventing suffering in circumstances where it otherwise would have occurred. Animals can't show these virtues or proto-virtues of showing resilience or courage through suffering if no suffering ever occurs. And I mean, I don't want to like stand up for. I'm not sure how much weight those theodicies can bear, but it does seem that at least some of the moves made by some theodicies, like you couldn't tell those stories if God was going to make these kind of miraculous.
Yeah, and I mean, there is also the point. It's just like, making all the hedonic experiences just like slightly more intense, or, that doesn't seem to involve deception. Like everyone, instead of our default state is just slightly pleasure, or something like that. Like in the aggregate, that just amounts to many, many more utils of pleasure. They might think it doesn't seem to involve anything.
That's true. I mean, one thought I have here about, bringing in the problem of evil at this point is, So suppose we've got a monkey and it types out it types out a sonnet. And so someone gives their like Bayesian argument that this is not a normal monkey. This is something weird is going on. This is a specially trained monkey or whatever. And someone comes in and it's like, well, but look at the sonnet. There's all these imperfections and that hardly even rhymes. And like that, it's just not a great tone. Like, I feel like if the question was, is this a normal monkey or something weird is going on? The fact that it's a sonnet at all shows that the normal monkey hypothesis is off the table. So if we take this as like an argument that the psychophysical laws have this suspiciously fortunate character that is just so dramatically unlikely on naturalism, and where you could see good reasons why some kind of designer would choose something like this, then picking holes are like, but couldn't it be better in that way? And you could make this adjustment. It feels like saying, well, it's not a very good poem to the monkey case.
Yeah, but that might be really good evidence that it's not a perfect monkey. Sure. Something like that.
So I do think that that's potentially relevant to, does this support theism or does it just knock out naturalism? And in the paper, we really just kind of take theism and naturalism as the two views on the table. And really, this is just an argument against naturalism. I don't think it better supports theism than like there's certain other design hypotheses that I think,
like limited God hypothesis. Maybe there's like the cosmos, like cosmopsychism, like value-directed cosmopsychism that talks about it's about why the universe.
Maybe some Nagel-style teleological laws. Yeah, I think we don't want to say that the psychophysical harmony data supports theism more than those other kind of non-naturalistic alternatives. I think that choice needs to be made on other grounds.
Yeah, and okay, so we're going to move on just to what I'll do one last objection to psychophysical harmony, and then we'll very briefly deal with nomological harmony, and then we'll wrap up. As always, there are many more objections to consider for psychophysical harmony. One that we'll just go through next is what some people will call like the revenge problem.
Yeah.
So we might think when we look at the theistic hypothesis, it seems like there's a lot of maybe suspicious harmony on God's, like God wills something and lo and behold, it comes about.
Yeah.
Or, God, we just describe the theistic hypothesis in such a way that there are suspicious correlations between God's mental states and the world, between God's mental states and other mental states. God might seem to be psychologically harmonious, psychophysically harmonious with the world.
Yeah.
We're not saying that there are these meta laws that like govern God, but it's more sort of just like a description, a striking description of the pairings between God's mental states and the world. And you might think that like most conceivable ways that a foundational mind could be are disharmonious, like sometimes it wills that P and P doesn't come about, and other times it wills that P and it does. So one might think that you're just purchasing predictive power with respect to the data of psychophysical harmony by just correspondingly decreasing the kind of intrinsic or prior probability of your hypothesis.
Yeah.
You're positing a very harmonious God into the picture to solve things. So that's one way to put the kind of revenge problem.
Yeah.
What do you make of that objection?
Yeah. So I guess my thought is harmony within God, or the sorts of intra-divine harmonies you're discussing, are just entailed by theism. They're entailed by the hypothesis that at the foundation of reality is a perfect being. And so any argument that theism itself has a not super low prior probability would just be an argument that the intra-divine harmonies are not super improbable.
And that's roughly where I was thinking you'd go. I mean, do you think it's at least conceivable that there could be a perfect being which, at least like sometimes its will is not enacted, like it wills that P, but P doesn't come about? Do you think that's at least conceivable? Like, what if it's not even... Like, what I'm thinking is sometimes theism, at least depending on your view of theism, like Eugen Nagasala, he has this maximal God approach where what perfections we ascribe to God kind of depends on what's possible in the first place.
Yeah.
So if it's not even possible, let's say, for there to be a being whose will is infallibly efficacious, then it actually may very well be conceivable for there to be perfect being in the maximal God sense, which nevertheless, its will may very well sometimes not be infallibly efficacious. And if that's the case, well, then we might actually think that you could have theism while also having certain, like, disharmonies within.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean, the way I tend to think about the the theistic hypothesis for these purposes is something like a being that has all perfections, as opposed to a being that's greater than any other possible being or has the package of properties that taken all together is best of any other package of properties. I mean, if you could argue that the perfections are like mutually incompatible, that would take the view out of the running, and that's a whole separate discussion. But like, if you can think of the theistic hypothesis as just a being with all perfections, then all it takes is to argue that having a necessarily efficacious will is a perfection, which seems pretty plausible. And is it conceivable that that's right? I guess in some sense, sure, these judgments are fallible, like what things are perfections and what aren't. But that seems pretty solid. Like that when you will P, like P occur, it's like, seems like a defect in a being if like sometimes it tries to do X, but it fails, or it's temporarily paralyzed, or it messes up. Like that seems like a paradigmatic case of a defect. So the idea that having a necessarily efficacious will is a perfection seems about as solid as anything in this domain. You know, it's recognizing that there's a lot of fallibility in judgment.
Okay, so we are going to move on to the argument from nomological harmony.
Yeah.
Again, for the audience, there are many other considerations that we could go down. There are other responses that Brian has been holding off, and there are other objections that I've been holding off. So we can't get into everything here, so just be aware of that. But I'll link to Brian's and Dustin's paper in the description, and maybe some other resources on psychophysical harmony if you want to check those out. So check the description. And of course, I'll also put a link down there to all of Brian's work, so you should immediately read it all. Okay. So for maybe the last 10 minutes, we'll talk about nomological harmony. So what is this argument?
Good. So the starting point is this observation that our universe is governed by laws that match its contents or its states. So, there are massive bodies, and sure enough, there are laws saying how massive bodies are to behave. There are laws about how charged particles are to behave, and sure enough, there are charged particles for those laws to govern. It didn't obviously have to be this way, so there could conceivably have been mismatches between the laws and the content of our universe. So maybe there could have been laws saying how massive things are to behave, but no massive things for those laws to govern. Maybe only massive things and no massive things. Or there could have been there could have been massive things, but the only laws there are specify how massive things are to behave, and so on. Okay, so the analogy we use in the paper, this is Brad Sodenheim, is you can think of the contents of the universe as kind of like the game pieces, and the laws of the universe as like the rule book. And it's possible to have mismatched rule books and game pieces. So like a rule book for chess isn't going to provide any guidance for how states of a Go board should evolve. And so a universe with mismatched laws and contents would be a bit like a game with a mismatched set of game pieces and a rule book. So the puzzle of nomological harmony is just the puzzle with the question of why are the laws and contents matched in this harmonious way? And specifically the way the aspect of this we want to focus on is, why is it that the dynamical laws of our universe, so those are the laws that kind of constrain or determine how the universe evolves over time, why do they match the initial conditions of the universe so as to produce temporal evolution? And basically, we go through a range of potential explanations and argue that some kind of non-naturalistic explanation, some third factor explanation, maybe theistic or something in the vicinity, is going to be the best, most theoretically virtuous explanation for nomological harmony, this kind of harmonious match between the laws and initial conditions or the contents of our universe. And so just to kind of go through some options. So the one that springs to everyone's mind when we initially pose the puzzle is, maybe there's a bunch of laws. There's laws about mass, there's laws about schmass, there's laws about charge, there's laws about schmarge. Most of these laws are just inert. They don't do anything because they govern certain properties that just aren't instantiated anywhere in reality. But given that there are enough laws governing the full range of possible fundamental properties, it's no surprise that at least some of them would apply to the actual contents of the universe and thereby produce some interesting temporal evolution. So with our game analogy, like if you've got every possible rule book under the sun in like one set of game pieces, it would be unsurprising if at least one of your rule books like applied to the game pieces and you've lost. There are other versions of this. So maybe you have one relatively simple set of laws.
There's a bunch of different initial conditions.
But yeah, you've got a zillion universes with like, some of them have like mass and charge at the initial conditions. Some have mass and schmarge. And most of these universes are stillborn because the laws don't apply to them. But given enough universes, it's no surprise that the actual laws would apply to one of them. And then observation selection effect, no surprise that we find ourselves in one of the harmonious universes because the stillborn ones don't feature any observers. Okay. So basically our problem with, well, there are a lot of problems with specific versions of these, but the main thread that goes through our objections to this kind of view is just kind of parsimony consideration. So the multiverse view that I just described is going to suffer from like a low degree of qualitative parsimony. It's going to be very qualitatively unparsimonious in the sense of, so that's has to do with like how many fundamental kinds of things or fundamental instantiated properties do you have in your theory. Other versions are going to score very poorly with respect to nomological parsimony, which is the dimension of parsimony that has to do with keeping the set of fundamental laws as small and simple as possible. So I think all versions of this kind of ensemble approach, as we call it, are going to suffer from serious parsimony problems.
Can I interject on the parsimony? I'm always a little bit skeptical on appeals to parsimony because, like, there, as you have just been indicating, there are a bunch of different dimensions of parsimony, but also there's something very natural and elegant about a kind of plenitudinous picture of various different domains, like mathematical objects. Like we don't, I mean, typically it's actually taken as a virtue to have a kind of plenitudinous view in the mathematical domain where you just admit all consistent mathematical structures exist. Similarly with like modal realism, like the view that all possible worlds concretely exist as space-time manifolds that are spatio-temporally disconnected from our world. Actuality is just kind of just an indexical feature of where we happen to find ourselves. I've never really been terribly convinced by parsimony appeals in that context. It's a very kind of elegant picture. It's very unified. It's very simple. All worlds exist. Very simple. Non-arbitrary, no arbitrary limits.
Yeah. So I agree with that. I mean, I agree. Like the mathematical case is convincing. If you have some kind of comprehension principle about what abstract exists, that gives you a lot of things, but which things exist are summarized by this very simple principle. That's a significant form of parsimony that makes the theory attractive. Or, universal theories of composition. In some sense, they're very profligate because you get lots of objects, but the basic principles telling you which objects exist are very simple. And so you might similarly, and I agree with modal realism too. So you might similarly suggest maybe there's like a plenitude principle that every law, every conceivable law, every possible law obtains. That would be a version of the law ensemble view that is at least arguably parsimonious in respects that matter. I don't think that view is going to work because it's going to lead to conflicting laws. So laws that dictate incompatible courses of evolution from the same initial state. So like on this view, it's unsurprising that some law tells our universe what to do given this distribution of mass. The problem is there's too many conflicting laws telling
A's attract A's, A's repel A.
Yeah. So one way of putting this is you want enough laws that it's unsurprising that some would apply to the actual contents of our universe. The cleanest way to do that is to have all possible laws, but that leads to conflicting laws. But in general, you don't want so many that you're going to get conflict.
Yeah, what about all possible initial conditions? And you could maybe say one set of laws?
Well,
one set of laws, all possible initial conditions, basically. So it's an ensemble solution with the initial conditions, but by which I mean different universes, with different initial conditions. Not going to get any incompatible dictates for what's going to...
Yeah, good. So that... Yeah, so and then that's going to be like a really large multiverse, so much bigger than the multiverses you would need to deal with standard fine-tuning problems, but it would include all of those as well. So that would kind of, that might promise to explain cosmological fine-tuning and nomological harmony in one fell swoop, and be kind of parsimonious in one sense that matters, which is like the whole theory is subsumed by this kind of plenitude principle. That's a cool idea. We don't consider that version in the paper, to the best of my recollection. It's close to, well, I guess it doesn't give you anything quite like Lewisian modal realism, because most of these universes are going to be stillborn.
True. And also, I don't need to say that these are the grounds of possibility. Like, this is all part of the actual world. We might think.
Right.
So I don't have to.
Sure. Yeah. Those parts of modal realism you wouldn't need to take on board.
Right. But otherwise, it's like, if you're looking at it from a God's eye picture, it looks the same.
Yeah. Good. Wait, actually, I take back what I said a minute. So it looks like this wouldn't account for cosmological fine-tuning. Right, because there would still be the fact that the laws and constants of our universe seem to be fine-tuned for life. So you'd need a different explanation for that. Anyway, that's not an objection, but just that one potential advantage of this. But there is a kind of, like, you could say every possible combination of laws and initial conditions. For every possible combination of laws and initial conditions,
every consistent,
there's a universe that with that pair, and most of those are going to be mismatched. So most of those are going to be stillborn universes. But
so it's like a dual ensemble.
Yeah. So that might give you something a little bit closer to a Lewisian pluriverse without the interpretation of modality commitment. I don't have any huge objections.
Like devastating.
Offhand.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that does come to mind with this is, like, one thing that I think is kind of attractive about theism is, like, you do get a kind of unified solution to, like, psychophysical harmony, fine-tuning, nomological harmony, and various other sorts of things. Now, of course, you have various problems, of course, but whereas for this dual ensemble solution, maybe you get nomological harmony, maybe you also get fine-tuning. But, like, you still got this puzzle of psychophysical harmony. It's got other puzzles like moral knowledge and other sorts of things.
It's not as nicely summarizes what I think of as the main attraction of it's an attraction that I think is understated by piecemeal evaluations of, like, this argument and this argument and this argument. It's really, there's a range of like 10 to 12 striking facts for which theism provides a unified explanation.
Are you done for one more objection very briefly?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but should I get to the power? Well, there's other potential explanation.
Okay.
Powers explanation.
Oh, I was actually going to bring those up as like, what if we take different theories of laws and then we follow the argument like that under a kind of Humean view where laws don't really govern things and push pull things, but instead are mere descriptions of, maybe the most sophisticated human account of the best systems account or best systems analysis, where the laws are just consistent, informative, simple summaries of the space-time mosaic of qualities. Under that sort of picture, it's no surprise that the laws would apply to the world. And similarly, if we go with like a power theory of laws or a dispositional essentialist theory of laws, laws are just descriptions of the causal powers and dispositions of things. Yeah. And it's no surprise that laws would apply to, again, they're just mere descriptions of things. Yeah. So no surprise there. So what do you think about those two sorts of things? Yeah,
so totally agreed. On Humean conception of laws, there's no surprise at all as to why the laws would match the actual state. Or more specifically, there's no surprise as to why, given there are laws, the laws would apply to the actual state. That's just going to kind of fall out from the Humean's best system analysis of lawhood. The real puzzle for Humeanism, we think, lies further back. Like, why does the universe exhibit these simple, exceptionless regularities at all? Like, why is it seems like intuitively most Humean mosaics would be chaotic, incompressible, messy, TV static-like horribleness. Most would not exhibit simple, tidy regularities. So I think that the real puzzle for like naturalistic Humeanism is why is the universe orderly at all? Why is it such as to be described with simple, strong laws? But totally concede the point that given that the universe exhibits these law-like regularities, there's no mystery as to why the actual laws apply to the states. For the powers view, the response is a little bit different. So here we think, so if you think a law is just a description of the causal powers conferred by actually instantiated natural properties, then yes, there's no surprise as to why the laws match the contents of the universe. But there is an analogous problem, which is, why is it that the various powerful properties present at the initial conditions are harmoniously coordinated with one another so as to induce temporal evolution? So this doesn't come for free on a powers view of laws. So, just to illustrate, like, suppose you've got X's at the initial conditions, and X's only have the power to move nearby Y's. Well, if there are no Y's around at the initial conditions, then the universe is stillborn. Nothing interesting happens. Or if there are X's and Y, there are X's and Y's at the initial conditions, and X's and Y's have the power to move one another when they stand in some Newtonian spatial relationship. Well, if they find themselves in like a relativistic spatial arena, then the universe will be stillborn. Nothing's gonna happen. So the key point here is, like, you need a degree of kind of fine-tuned harmonious coordination among the powerful properties in order to guarantee that their stimulus conditions are met. Otherwise, you don't have like temporal evolution of the universe. So we have an analogous problem on powers views. And so what I'm partial to powers views of laws, but I think since you need to explain why the various powerful properties are reciprocally coordinated with one another so as to like make interesting stuff happen. Here, I think theism can provide some resources. Alternatively, if you have like a governing view of laws, then I think theism might come in and explain like why there would be a match between the primitive governing laws and the contents of the universe. If you have a Humean view of laws, then I think the role of God would be further back in explaining the regularity of the mosaic, why the Humean mosaic is such as to be described with simple, strong generalizations at all.
Awesome. So we could go back and forth, but I think we are out of time. Well, thanks for joining me. Do you have any parting words for the audience? Any parting words of wisdom?
We live in a harmonious world. You need to appreciate this fact.
Yeah. Well, the world is striking in various ways.
It's striking.
It strikes us in a positive direction. We see various harmonies, but it's also striking that there's strikingly bad in various other ways. And that's why this is so difficult and why I'm an agnostic. But
I thought this interview, I hope, was not strikingly bad.
Right. No, I think it was strikingly good. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. And
happy to be here.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this conversation, check out Brian's work. It's linked in the description. He's got lots of really cool papers, lots of really great work. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button, turn on that little bell with notifications. Consider supporting me on Patreon. And of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.